Believe you can do it. Motivational speech. Excited. Imagine standing at the edge of a high dive. Your heart rate surges, your palms grow cold, and a microsecond decision looms. In that instant, your brain isn't calculating physics or measuring water depth. It is running an ancient subconscious simulation. Deep within your limbic system, the amygdala fires a signal: danger, retreat. But simultaneously, your prefrontal cortex, the seat of executive function, self-awareness, and intentional thought, has the potential to step in, override the alarm, and reframe the fear as readiness. Curious, this psychological tug-of-war happens thousands of times a day. We experience it when stepping onto a stage, launching a bold career move, initiating a difficult conversation, or striving toward a goal that feels just beyond our reach. We often call the winning outcome confidence or talent. But behavioral science and neuroscience tell a far more fascinating story. What actually determines whether you jump or retreat isn't raw talent, superior intellect, or innate luck. It is a trainable psychological mechanism known as self-efficacy, the deeply internalized belief in your ability to execute the actions required to produce specific performance attainments. Self-efficacy isn't empty self-talk. It is not standing in front of a mirror repeating hollow affirmations while your brain quietly rejects every word. True self-belief is a physiological state. It alters how your nervous system responds to stress, how your brain allocates attention, and how resiliently you recover from failure. When you lack self-efficacy, every setback feels like proof of your inadequacy, triggering a cascade of stress hormones that impair working memory and decision-making. When you cultivate self-efficacy, setbacks are processed not as threats to your identity, but as structural data, information to be analyzed, adapted to, and overcome. The human brain is remarkably malleable. Through targeted self-awareness, emotional regulation, and focused mental rehearsal, you can physically rewire the neural pathways that govern how you respond to challenge. Believing you can do something is not a passive feeling. It is an active cognitive strategy. By mastering the internal dialogue between emotion and reason, you unlock an untapped reserve of resilience and potential. Self-belief is not wishful thinking. It is a neurological filter that determines whether the brain treats challenges as threats or opportunities. True confidence requires emotional regulation, learning to notice stress responses without letting them dictate action. Attention is a muscle. Directing focus toward solutions rather than obstacles physically rewires cognitive loops. High emotional intelligence redefines failure from an identity-defining event into objective data for growth. To understand why self-belief is the fundamental catalyst for human achievement, we must first look past the superficial realm of positive thinking and examine the neurobiology of how our minds process reality. Self-belief is not an abstract mood, nor is it a blind optimism that ignores life's difficulties. At its most fundamental level, self-belief is a sophisticated cognitive filter, a neurobiological lens through which your brain continuously evaluates environmental stimuli, assesses risk, and calculates the probability of success. Every second, your brain receives millions of bits of sensory information, far more than your conscious mind can process. To navigate this overwhelming flood of data, your brain relies on neural pathways and reticular activating networks to decide what deserves your focus and what should be filtered out. When you operate from a baseline of self-doubt or helplessness, your brain's threat detection circuitry interprets challenges as insurmountable hazards. The amygdala registers the magnitude of the task and triggers a cascade of stress hormones, primarily cortisol and adrenaline. This physiological response physically narrows your perceptual field, impairs working memory in the prefrontal cortex, and restricts your ability to think creatively or strategically. In essence, doubt creates a biological feedback loop where your brain actively looks for evidence of your limitations, finds it, and uses that evidence to justify retreat. Conversely, when you cultivate genuine self-efficacy and emotional regulation, you change the fundamental neural architecture through which you experience difficulty. You alter the chemical environment of your own brain. When presented with a complex problem or an ambitious goal, a brain anchored in self-belief does not perceive the situation as an existential threat to identity. It frames it as a puzzle to be solved. This subtle psychological pivot shifts neural activation away from the primitive, reactive emotional centers and toward the higher-order executive functions of the prefrontal cortex. Dopamine, the neurotransmitter responsible for motivation, reward, and goal-directed behavior, is released not just when you achieve a goal, but when you anticipate that your efforts will yield a meaningful result. This means that self-belief chemically fuels the drive and cognitive flexibility required to persist through friction. You begin to notice resources, strategies, and solutions that a mind consumed by self-doubt would completely overlook. Success is rarely a function of raw intelligence or isolated talent. It is governed by the brain's capacity to maintain executive functioning under pressure, and that capacity is dictated by what you believe about your own agency. Your nervous system is constantly adapting to the internal narratives you repeat, reinforcing the neural pathways that dictate whether you lean into discomfort or shrink away from it. By grounding your self-belief in self-awareness and emotional mastery, you are actively rewiring the neurobiological foundation of how you interact with the world, turning potential into actionable competence. The secondary pillar of emotional intelligence and self-efficacy lies in mastering the brain's survival mechanism, specifically overcoming what modern psychology calls the amygdala hijack. Deep within the architecture of the human brain rests the limbic system, an ancient set of structures responsible for emotional processing, motivation, and survival instincts. At the heart of this system sits the amygdala, a small, almond-shaped cluster of nuclei designed to act as an instantaneous early warning radar for potential threats. When our ancestors encountered physical predators, the amygdala's ability to instantly bypass conscious analytical thought and flood the body with stress hormones was the difference between survival and death. In our modern landscape, however, physical threats from wild predators are largely replaced by psychological stressors, high-stakes public speaking, critical feedback, financial uncertainty, or the terrifying prospect of failing at a lifelong ambition. The fundamental glitch in human design is that the amygdala cannot distinguish between a physical threat to your life and a psychological threat to your ego, reputation, or self-esteem. When you face a daunting challenge, your amygdala reacts with the exact same primal alarm system, releasing adrenaline and cortisol while hijacking the neural pathways leading to your prefrontal cortex, the region of your brain responsible for logic, long-term planning, decision-making, and emotional regulation. This neural hijack is why smart, capable people often freeze, procrastinate, or act impulsively when under extreme pressure. Their analytical mind has been temporarily taken offline by a biological false alarm. True confidence and sustained self-belief do not mean living in a state where this stress response never occurs. That would be a biological impossibility. Instead, high emotional intelligence requires developing the capacity to recognize this physiological reaction in real time and consciously reclaim control from the limbic system. The moment you experience the rapid pulse, the shallow breathing, or the sudden urge to abandon a difficult task, Emotional self-awareness acts as a circuit breaker. By simply observing the physical sensation of fear without reacting to it, you initiate a process known in neuroscience as affect labeling. When you consciously identify and name what you are feeling, acknowledging that your nervous system is experiencing a temporary stress response rather than a real crisis, you re-engage the prefrontal cortex. This neurobiological shift dials down the firing rate of the amygdala, reducing the surge of stress chemicals and restoring your cognitive bandwidth. Taming the amygdala hijack allows you to create a crucial gap between stimulus and response, transforming a knee-jerk emotional reaction into an intentional, reasoned choice. You learn to interpret the physiological arousal of fear not as a warning sign to retreat, but as energy to be harnessed, reframing nervousness as readiness and anxiety as heightened focus. When you master this internal calibration, self-belief ceases to be a fragile state vulnerable to every emotional storm, and instead becomes a durable, regulated capacity to remain composed, clear-headed, and effective precisely when the pressure is at its highest. The third core dimension of sustained achievement moves beyond emotional regulation and anchors itself in the psychological construct of self-efficacy, the deeply held belief in your ability to organize and execute the actions required to manage prospective situations. While modern culture often conflates self-belief with vague self-esteem or unearned optimism, behavioral science reveals that true confidence is grounded in actual competence and the progressive accumulation of micro-masteries. Self-esteem is merely an evaluation of one's self-worth, whereas self-efficacy is a precise functional judgment of capability. When an individual lacks self-efficacy, their internal locus of control is externalized. They attribute their successes to luck, timing, or external circumstances, while viewing their failures as permanent reflections of their personal inadequacy. Conversely, developing a robust sense of self-efficacy shifts the internal locus of control inward, instilling a profound understanding that outcomes are largely a function of effort, strategy, and persistent execution. This psychological shift rests heavily on what psychologist Albert Bandura identified as mastery experiences. Every time you set a small, clear intention and complete it, despite internal resistance, fatigue, or self-doubt, you provide your brain with empirical evidence of your own agency. You cannot trick the human mind into feeling confident through empty verbal affirmations or superficial motivational platitudes, because the prefrontal cortex constantly cross-references your conscious thoughts against your historical track record of action. True belief is built slowly, brick by brick, through a feedback loop of setting realistic targets, applying deliberate effort, and observing tangible progress. When you experience micro-masteries, your brain registers these small victories not as accidental anomalies, but as structural data confirming that your actions have direct, predictable consequences on your environment. Over time, this consistent reinforcement builds an unshakable psychological resilience that buffers you against major setbacks. When facing a complex or intimidating challenge, an individual with high self-efficacy does not become overwhelmed by the magnitude of the ultimate goal. Instead, they strategically break the overarching objective down into smaller, manageable subcomponents, applying their energy solely to the immediate task at hand. This systematic approach prevents cognitive overload and maintains a steady stream of small dopamine releases, which chemically reinforces the motivation to continue moving forward. Furthermore, grounding self-belief in competence fosters an adaptable mindset that views personal skills not as fixed traits set in stone, but as malleable assets capable of continuous expansion through deliberate practice. Rather than seeking comfort in familiar routines, individuals with strong self-efficacy actively seek out optimal challenges, tasks that lie just beyond their current skill level, because they recognize that friction is the precise mechanism that triggers neuroplasticity and growth. They do not rely on external validation, applause, or perfection to feel capable. Their confidence stems from an internal, reliable awareness that they possess the cognitive and emotional tools necessary to navigate uncertainty, solve novel problems, and continuously refine their craft through focused, disciplined action. The fourth essential pillar of emotional intelligence and self-mastery centers on the understanding that focus is the primary architect of human performance and mental design. Attention is not merely a passive resource that happens to react to whatever shines brightest in your immediate environment. It is an active, highly selective cognitive tool that continuously shapes your neurochemistry, emotional state, and personal reality. At any given second, your conscious mind is capable of processing only a minuscule fraction of the vast sensory and psychological data available to it. What you choose to focus on within that narrow band of awareness dictates the precise nature of your internal narrative, your stress response, and ultimately, your capacity to execute goals. When an individual lacks attentional control, their focus naturally gravitates toward perceived threats, hypothetical obstacles, personal flaws, and past failures. This unmanaged focus acts as a continuous amplifier for anxiety, creating an internal environment where self-doubt thrives. From a neurological perspective, constantly rehearsing thoughts of inadequacy or worrying about potential catastrophes reinforces the very neural pathways associated with helplessness, physically strengthening the brain's habit of self-sabotage. Conversely, developing the discipline of directed focus allows you to purposefully govern the internal landscape of your mind. High emotional intelligence requires treating your attention like a muscle, one that must be consciously directed away from destructive reactive loops and anchored firmly onto constructive, actionable reality. When you face a crisis or a complex challenge, the untrained mind asks questions that drain agency, such as, "Why is this happening to me?" Or, "What if everything goes wrong?" A disciplined mind, however, uses attentional control to reframe the internal dialogue, instantly shifting focus toward strategic inquiry. What is the single most effective action I can take right now? Or, what part of this situation lies entirely within my control? This deliberate shift in focus directly influences the brain's reticular activating system, altering how you perceive your environment and enabling you to spot opportunities, resources, and solutions that were previously invisible. Furthermore, attention is the exact mechanism that drives neuroplasticity, the brain's remarkable ability to physically reorganize its structure in response to experience. Whatever you pay attention to repeatedly, your brain prioritizes, strengthens, and optimizes for future access. If you dedicate your focus to mastering a skill, managing your emotional reactions, and executing daily habits, your neural networks adapt to make those behaviors more automatic, efficient, and effortless over time. Directing your focus is not about ignoring reality or denying the existence of external difficulty. It is an act of strategic prioritization. It means acknowledging that while you cannot control every external variable, you maintain total sovereignty over where you invest your cognitive energy. By protecting your attention from constant distraction, superficial drama, and self-limiting thoughts, you build an enduring mental architecture that remains laser-focused on growth, execution, and high-level performance. The final dimension of emotional intelligence and long-term mastery involves fundamental redefinition of failure, transforming it from a devastating threat to personal identity into invaluable, objective feedback. In traditional psychological paradigms, failure is frequently experienced as an emotional catastrophe, an event that triggers deep shame, damages self-worth, and paralyzes future initiative. When an individual lacks emotional self-awareness, their sense of self is fragile, tightly bound to immediate outcomes and external validation. Under these conditions, making a mistake or falling short of a goal is interpreted by the limbic system as a profound personal defect, signaling to the brain that they are fundamentally inadequate. This identity-level perception of failure triggers a defensive survival mechanism, causing people to either rationalize their mistakes, blame external circumstances, or avoid taking risks altogether to protect their ego. High emotional intelligence, however, disrupts this destructive cycle by uncoupling an individual's core self-worth from the temporary outcome of any specific endeavor. Through the lens of advanced self-efficacy and cognitive reframing, failure ceases to be an emotional verdict on character and becomes what scientists consider pure, actionable data. When an experiment in a scientific laboratory fails to yield the predicted result, the researcher does not conclude that the scientific method is broken or that they are worthless as an individual. Instead, they treat the outcome as vital information that reveals what does not work, narrowing the path toward what does. A mind anchored in emotional intelligence applies this exact scientific rigor to personal and professional development. Every setback, error, or unexpected complication is stripped of its emotional toxicity and analyzed through a lens of objective inquiry. What variables contributed to this outcome? Which assumptions were incorrect? What adjustments must be made to the strategy moving forward? This psychological pivot shifts the brain out of the defensive, threat-oriented state governed by the amygdala and re-engages the analytical, problem-solving networks of the prefrontal cortex. Furthermore, viewing failure as informational feedback is the essential driver of neuroplasticity and skill acquisition. Biological adaptation does not occur when everything goes smoothly and effortlessly. Neural circuits are signaled to adjust, refine, and strengthen, precisely when the brain encounters friction, error, and difficulty. When you push yourself to the edge of your current capability and make a mistake, your brain registers the discrepancy between the intended outcome and the actual result, triggering targeted neurochemical changes that prime your neural pathways for learning. By welcoming friction as a necessary mechanism for growth, rather than fleeing from it as a threat, you cultivate a profound level of psychological resilience that makes you practically immune to defeat. You begin to understand that the path to high achievement is not a straight line of uninterrupted successes, but an iterative loop of action, feedback, adaptation, and execution. When you embrace failure as information, every setback becomes a stepping stone. Every mistake refines your strategy, and your capacity to persist through ambiguity becomes an unstoppable force.